Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the London Shakespeare Seminar. I'm feeling incredibly excited to be sharing this session and looking forward to these wonderful sounding papers. So as Hannah said, we'll start with the papers and then we'll go straight to the Q&A. May I just ask you to please keep your mics off during the presentations so there's no sort of extra noise interfering with the sound. And we'll be taking questions at the very end. So we'll go straight from the first paper to the second, and then we'll have all the questions at the end. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Colby Gordon and Robert Stagg, who are both here. If you want to say hello. So we'll start with Colby's paper entitled Man in Hue, Shakespeare's Trans Philology. Currently an assistant professor in the Department of Literatures and in English at Bryn Mawr College, Colby Gordon earned a PhD in comparative literature from UC Irvine. He has published articles on transgender embodiment and creation narratives in Shakespeare's sonnets, trans confession and lyric obscurity in the poetry of John Donne, trans animality in the Duchess of Malfi, sounding great, as well as work on host desecration narratives, political aesthetics, and architecture. With Simon Chess and Will Fisher, he edited a special issue of the Journal of Early Modern Cultural Studies on early modern trans studies. Professor Gordon is currently at work on a manuscript entitled Glorious Bodies, Trans Theology and Renaissance Literature. It's wonderful to have you, Colby. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shia, for that kind introduction. And thank you for everyone to coming. And I'm just so grateful to be here to share a piece that for me is a bit of an experiment. So thank you to Professors Scott Bauman and Crawford for hosting me. I know it's an extraordinary amount of work to put on a speaker series like this, and it's just such a service to all of us. So I'm going to try to screen share. Let's see if that works. Okay, can everyone see that? Wonderful. In the end, it's the cutting they just can't get past, I think. The skin touched by the scalpel, the surgeon's hands passing into the body, the pound of flesh. It's not that transphobes are unconcerned with hormones or pronouns or our presence in public spaces. Paranoia is, after all, the delusion of a totalizing system, so nothing about our existence can escape the transphobes' obsessive fantasies. But it is the surgery, whatever that means, that readies them for conspiracies of seduced children and organ theft, that opens up the common ground they have come to share with American evangelicals, and worse. Those fully radicalized into this moral panic would have you believe that such procedures are new. But in reality, out of all the interventions that today constitute something like trans embodiment, genital modification is among the very oldest, boasting a history that reaches back literally thousands of years. Bearing in mind the deep history of transness and transphobia, this essay digs into the fear of transcutting that pops up in an unexpected place, Shakespeare's Sonnet 20. It's a poem about a trans feminine love interest, Sonnet 20, and the apparently playful but implicitly violent impulse to come to grips with what that means for the identity of the poem's speaker, who attempts to align the woman's face and woman's heart of his beloved with the prick whose presence in the final couplet appears to offer the final word on the matter. While it is the prick that takes center stage in critical conversations about the poem's erotic possibilities, including in my own earlier work, today I want to enter the sonnet through another opening, one tucked away in the middle, where the youth is described as a man in hue, all hues in his controlling. It is a line that tends to be read as a comment on artifice, a nod to the youth's mastery of the cosmetic techniques used to craft a feminine face. From this vantage, the sonnet pits a deceptive exterior against the real gender defined by the anatomy that lies beneath, an ugly epistemology of surface and depth upon which transphobic hysteria depends. And yet, it's not so clear that the line is only interested in tinting, tincturing, and powdering. After all, in the 1609 quarto edition of the sonnets, every instance of hue, as in color, was printed hue, as in cut, an orthographic decision that is corrected, modernized, or banished to the apparatus by modern editors. Rather than excising the bad, misleading hue and substituting a homograph that is more easily reconciled to the tone of jokey transphobia, I linger over the manifold semantic meanings established by the 16th century convergence of the pair of hues. Taking up Geoffrey Masten's maxim that the study of sex and gender in historically distant cultures is necessarily a philological investigation, my approach is also shaped by two recent essays in trans philology. The first, by Marjorie Rubright, explores trans's prefixial scattering effect that confounds directionality, conveys, operates as a live circuitry between, for instance, forms of gendered embodiment, and jams the teleology of ontological conversion across kind in favor of endlessly combinatorial mixing. Likewise, Joey Gamble's Towards a Trans Philology presses us to be attentive to the diachronic pitch and yaw of a word, marking with scattered breadcrumbs some, though certainly not all, of the places words end up. The lexical domain outlined by the confluence of the hues works transtemporally, joining the master-mistress of Sonnet 20 with a set of strange and surprising companions, including the botched sacrifices of Titus Andronicus and Julius Caesar, as well as its sister poems in Joss Charles' 2018 collection, Field. In this trans-philological reading of Sonnet 20, the combinatorial conveyances of hue move across gender, species, and race to imagine what kinds of cuts can make or unmake a man in hue, a hewn man, or a human. So, people want access, okay. So, the two forms of hue follow different etymological paths into modern English. Widespread and old and Indo-European hue in the sense of cutting is a reflex of cow, meaning strike and maybe forge, a root with derivatives including Latin cudo, to strike, beat, or knock, Middle Irish cowed, meaning war, and Tocharian a cot, to split off, break, chop up or down, and crush, and also Old English hewen. By contrast, hue in the sense of color possesses a diffuse and evocative lexical field. Its cognates and etyma are skin words, from the Proto-Indo-European Q and Sanskrit chavi, meaning cuticle, skin or hide, beauty and splendor or complexion, to the Swedish, Old Norse, and Norwegian he, meaning skin and complexion, birds down, fine, especially gray hair, and fluff or mold. Other senses bind the term to superficiality, as in the Gothic hiwi, meaning appearance or show, and Icelandic higomi, meaning vanity. It has also been suggested that hue might derive from the Proto-Indo-European kiwo, a color adjective of broad application that gives us the Lithuanian shiwas, meaning white, Sanskrit siawa, brown, and Tocharian b quele, meaning black or dark gray. In its uses, hue can be ghostly, spectral, both part of a body and detachable from it. The Middle English Dictionary glosses change in hue as to change color because of emotion or pain, to blush or blanch, to change one's color, as in of soil, or to become blood-stained. Rapidly losing color by transferring blood to soil also registers in hue, as Oliver and Sir Ferumbrus, that hueless was of semblant, for he bore many a wound. Hue can be disembodied, an apparition or phantasm, as in Lydgate's Assembly of Gods. When I saw it, it was but a hue, a dream, a fantasy, and a thing of naught. The term's close attachment to skin flows through its medieval and early modern meanings. Sometimes hue indicates complexion, whether a natural skin tone or a cosmetic augmentation. The Romaunt of the Roses Dame franchise is described as neither brown nor dun of hue, but white as snow, fallen new, while Pori's 1600 translation of Leo Africanus features women contenting themselves only with their natural hue. As an attribute of skin rather than an artificial coloring or coating, this sense also appears in the phrase hide in hue, as in the King of Tars, whose formless infant is given a shape upon its baptism, being awarded with limbs and face, as well as hide in hue, bone and fell, and every limb. The etymological paths followed by hue sketch a semantic field of skin and color, including skin color. Hue tells us something about the quality of the skin, whether it is brown, dun, or white, whether it is a natural tone or one falsely fashioned through the feminine art of cosmetics. At points, the meanings associated with hue are abstract, a tone or tint or shade, but the term also enjoys a certain earthy materiality. Sometimes hue dwells inside the skin, the rush of blood to the cheek that follows shock or shame. Bloodless bodies lack a hue, as in the exsanguinated Oliver, and a ghost is nothing but a hue, stubbornly persisting on without a body. At other points, the senses at play encompass something follicular, attached to or emerging from the skin. The word's reflexes in a set of delicate excrescences like fluff, birds down, fine hair and cuticles, bodily matter whose relationship to the core self was a matter of religious and philosophical debate. The separating senses of this semantic field attached to life on the cusp of death, or giving signs of death's approach, corpses blossoming with mold, a bruised body bleeding out into the dust, soil enriched with blood, thinning gray hair, and skin on the body or off of it. There is a vibrant materiality to hue and its cognates, which mark processes of death and decomposition that coincide with an excess of life. If we are attentive to the semantic field in play, to be a man in hue indicates something not only about the youth's gender and the technical interventions that produced it, but also about race, complexion, and skin, senses that snap into focus when we revisit Shakespeare's other hues. Associating the master-mistress with hewing assigns the poem an unlikely and disquieting set of neighbors from the Shakespearean corpus, which affiliates this particular mode of cutting with scenes of abortive, failed, or badly mishandled sacrifice. Take, for instance, the human sacrifice that opens Titus Andronicus, when Lucius insists that the Roman victors give us the proudest prisoner of the Goths, that we may hew his limbs and on a pile admonish fratrum sacrifice his flesh. Titus Andronicus, of course, is a play obsessed with hues in every possible sense, from Aaron's assertion that coal black is better than another hue in that it scorns to bear another hue, to Marcus's blazon of Lavinia, which asks what stern and gentle hands have lopped and hewed and made thy body bare of her two branches. Such hewing as Lavinia suffers is mutilating, a wild and uncontrolled swinging of the axe that fells and planes the body. To use one of Hugh's lexical cognates, such cutting turns a human body into a hag, a stump, a heathery or turfy pit, the soft bog left after breaking the moss, or the portion of a forest marked off for cutting. A larvus, too, is a hag. The complex racialization of the Goths, compounded with their status as captives, sets them apart in a way that renders them available for such cutting. Lucius repeats his demand, make a fire straight, and with our swords upon a pile of wood, let's hew his limbs till they be clean consumed. The Gothic hue gives the prisoner over to a state of social death in which he can be felled like a tree and burned for fuel. As Noemi Ndaye argues in a powerful essay on racial discourse in Titus Andronicus, throughout the play, the image of a human body turning into a tree signifies the process of a human body turning, or well on its way to turning, into a corpse. Thus, the cuts that make a hag of a larvus wrap him into Hugh's lexical nexus, which embraces bodies between life and death, the skinned animal, and the overripe fruit surrendering to mold and mildew. In an adjacent scene of slaughter, Brutus choreographs Caesar's homicide by imploring his co-conspirators to carve him as a dish fit for the gods, rather than hew him as a carcass fit for hounds. Critics have aligned this grotesque possibility of Caesar's corpse being dismembered and fed to dogs with the routines and practices of the hunt. In linking this scene with the ritual of the reward, Edward Berry notes that the hunting instincts of mature hounds must be reinforced with every kill, with each dog being allotted its rightful share in the carcass so that they will achieve the difficult balance between obedience to man and instinctual wildness. The canine dimension of Brutus's plea to carve rather than hew resonates with another vignette in which the instrumental wildness of dogs was exercised as part of the colonial project. Bartolomé de las Casas illustrates how the ritual of the reward functioned in the New World, where the Spaniards train their fierce dogs to attack, kill, and tear to pieces the Indians. They keep alive their dogs' appetite for human beings in this way. They have the Indians brought to them in chains, then unleash the dogs. The Indians come meekly down the roads and are killed. And the Spaniards have butcher shops where the corpses of the Indian are hung up on display, and someone will come in and say, more or less, give me a quarter of that rascal hanging there to feed my dogs until I can kill another one for them. Deborah Miranda has clarified that in the colonial context, this particular form of punishment, to be eaten alive by dogs, was a form of gendercide, whose victims were often specifically third gender or two-spirit. This gruesome cross-species brutality testifies to colonial subjects' absolute exclusion from personhood, their ineligibility for legal protections that would shield them from the worst excesses of Spanish violence, up to and including cannibalism. Such practices were dehumanizing in many registers, most obviously because its victims were hunted, trimmed, and dressed like animals, but also because, as Carlo Freccero argues, the canary and holding dogs bred for this work were conscripted to infuse civilization with a certain virilizing savagery. It is such ultramasculine canine savagery that Brutus seeks to avoid in carving rather than hewing Caesar. Unlike the initial killing in Titus Andronicus, in Julius Caesar, all parties to the sacrifice are unambiguously white, and it is precisely this shared whiteness that Brutus hopes will afford a humane killing that maintains the humanity of the conspirators and their prey. Taken together, these episodes from Titus Andronicus and Julius Caesar work through the racialized dimension of hewing. That is, both scenes are about determining which bodies are available for a particularly violating kind of cut, and also about the lethal forms of legal and social marginalization inflicted upon those that endure the cutting. The story they tell belongs to the history of white supremacy. The hewn body exists in a state of what Lisa Marie Coccio calls racialized rightlessness, a half-life marked by exposure to extraordinary violence. At this point, I want to consider how these scenes of hewing might modulate a trans account of Sonnet 20. What might it mean to be a man in hue? Critical accounts of this ambiguous line tend to revolve around the question of cosmetics that animates so much of the sonnet's worrying over the effects of painting and gilding. And yet, printing hue as HEW forces the surface-level ornamentation implied by gilding to take on a menacing depth. The meticulous brushwork behind the illusion of the handcrafted femme face degenerates into a more agitated stroke. The light touch of powdering gives way to digging, gouging, and carving. There is a transtemporal resonance to the line. To feminize the face through cutting, not merely contouring, anticipates the surgical interventions that modify and, to some transphobic commentators, define trans embodiment. There is perhaps not such a great historical distance between early modern face painting and facial feminization surgery as we might think. Face flaying was very much on the menu in the 16th century, although the procedure was not performed with knives, but rather chemicals like mercury sublimate. In other words, painting could indeed be a matter of hues in both senses, as in the case recounted by Bosela in The Duchess of Malfi, who recalls a French woman with a complexion ravaged by smallpox who flayed the skin off her face to make it more level, quipping that whereas before she looked like a nutmeg grater, after she resembled an abortive hedgehog. Such cuts do not merely efface the work of nature's hand, as Sonnet 20 puts it, wresting the youth out of the gender apparently assigned by God. They eject the hewn body from the order of creation altogether, consigning it to prodigious monstrosity alongside the abortive hedgehog. There are both religious and racial dimensions to anti-cosmetic diatribes against hewing, as in William Prynne's Histriomastics, which denounced our effeminate, hairy men monsters for their genderqueer painting and costuming, practices that align them with Turkish eunuchs, the ancient Galli, whose virilities they did ofttimes dissect to make them more effeminate, and the passive, beastly sodomites in Florida and Peru. In concerning itself with the boundaries of the human and the hewn man, Sonnet 20 doubles the blows of Julius Caesar and Titus, whose cuts sever the bond that links the created body to God, the creator. These intertexts suggest that there is a sacramental aura to such incisions, and as it turns out, what distinguishes a felicitous ritual from its cannibalistic perversion hinges on the kind of cutting involved. From this perspective, when Sonnet 20 invokes the bending of the razor to the face, it doubles the irreligious piety of the play's ritual cuts, instituting a corrupted communion that alienates its participants from nature and creation. From this vantage, the controller of hues is another Lucius, brazenly wielding the blade that disfigures the divinely wrought contours of man as shaped in the image of God. Conversely, as a man in hue, the youth is the passive recipient of the violating blows, an innocent juvenile alarbus offered up in an obscene and fruitless sacrifice. Curiously, the religious reservations circling around the cut face prefigure the secular discourse of transphobia that casts trans people as both victims and perpetrators of the surgical technologies of transition, procedures understood as mutilation. By invoking a hewn body that hews, Sonnet 20 anticipates the fantasy of the predatory trans person who seduces and forcibly transitions innocent, impressionable children, and thereby threatens the reproductive futurity of the nation state. If the hue of Sonnet 20 is a trans cut, and I think that it is, then how might it relate to the racialized incisions at play in the term's other Shakespearean deployments? That is, the question arises of how we might include Sonnet 20 within trans history, which has always been, as Riley Snorton powerfully argues, a racial history. We might begin by noting that in the sonnet sequence at large, the youth's hue is firmly established as fair. The beloved promises to be the begetter of a fair child or so fair a house. Praise is lavished on my love's fair brow or fair aspect or fair imperfect shade. The poet sometimes just reduces the youth to his fair, the most special among every fair. As Kim Hall has argued, Sonnet 20 is as much about race as gender, given that the youth's gender ambiguity is undergirded by a less transgressive politics of color that awards their fairness a stability and power that contrasts with the gender fluidity elsewhere on display. To press that argument one step further, by pairing it with the conceptual vocabulary of trans studies, we might understand the youth's whiteness as a mitigating factor that softens the deadly potential of the hue that dismembers, butchers, and mutilates. In other words, the youth may be a hag, but not in the same sense as a larbus. While the threat of hewing is present, its violent undercurrents remain in the background, subsumed by the tenor of giddy, giggly playfulness that characterizes the poem. As an account of racialized gender, then, the hues of Sonnet 20 offer an opportunity to think intersectionally about the differential experiences of trans people, their availability for hewing in all possible senses: surgical modification, racialization, violence, and social death. While the semantic field I've been working with is, by and large, a disturbing affair, I want to end by suggesting that a reservoir of affirmative trans possibility emerges in the senses pooling around the pair of hues. To hew might involve dismemberment, but it also means to shape or to sculpt, to take an adze to wood or stone. To be a man in hue then might evoke the vocabulary of masonry, to suggest a rough-hewn man, a man undergoing hewing or cut out grossly, to use the definition floated by Barrett's Elviri. Such a man would be unformed, underdeveloped, even fetal. This is an abortive man, which is to say, a woman, according to Galenic physiology. Powder gives way to surgery, a trans cutting that gilds and gelds, a hewing that is feminizing in its effects but masculine in its execution. In the gash opened by this hue, Shakespeare's master mistress encounters the trans poetics of Jos Charles Field, which ingeniously rewires the narrative of transition by setting it in Spencerian orthography, which becomes almost a kind of text speak. Can't even mention what they're doing with those human parts. I am all floor, a whole filleted, a tran gets laid. Charles Field is replete with human parts, a phrase which encompasses, as Stephanie Burt notes, human parts, or parties where men use axes or get cut. The human is a man who is hewn as well as a man who hews, or the scraps left after a man has been cut. This is a hewing that occurs perhaps in the middle voice, passive in the sense that the subject acts upon herself. The dangers of such hewing are never far from the surface in Field. There are cops in my garden inspecting hues. Invagination means every hole is an extremity. The cut that invaginates leaves a field, a garden, a copse that immediately attracts cops, a policing surveillance that wants to lift the skirt for a salacious peek, a prelude to violation. Nevertheless, the poems embrace the possibility of hues, never insisting that the transitional body must be whole, complete, or intact. Instead, such a body is plural, scattered, and particulated, not a singular being, but a gathering of parts and persons in a coalitional and collective party. This account of trans embodiments leans into the disaggregating force of the hue, accepting that the cut may be violent and unsettling, but also embracing it as exciting, erotic, and desirable. Can't even mention what's happening with those human parts is a phrasing that hedges around the activities underway, the transformative but also unnerving experience of being opened up, cut, filleted, the field who gets laid. Hide and hew, bone and fell. The trans-cutting Harvard and Hughes verbal network embraces violation and dismemberment alongside ecstatic pleasure and transition. To return to where we began, Sonnet 20 is, at the end of the day, a chaser's poem. And while it can't tell us anything substantial about trans experience in the Renaissance, it might have another use. Tracing the lexical field sketched by Sonnet 20's Hughes might direct us to the early modern ancestors of contemporary transphobes, whose obsessive rejection of trans embodiment makes them the new anti-theatricalists, the inheritors of a Puritan suspicion of hewing that makes fragile, innocent white English youth dangerously close to the passive, beastly sodomites in Florida and Peru. Passive and beastly, but active and controlling, the transgender craze and the seduced daughter, Shakespeare's Man in Hugh is still with us, a little reservoir of infuriating pleasure and impossible contradiction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colby, for such a fascinating, thought-provoking paper. I know I've got so many questions, and I'm sure others do too, but we'll have to keep them till the end. Thanks again. Okay, then, we move on to the second paper today by Robert Stagg, and it's my pleasure to introduce him today. Robert Stagg is a Leverhulme Research Fellow at the Shakespeare Institute, Stratford-upon-Avon, and an Associate Fellow of St. Anne's College, Oxford. His first book, Shakespeare's Blank Verse, An Alternative History, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press, and he's currently working. Sorry, is that, no, not my voice, all right. He's currently at work on a second book titled Forms of Desire, Sex, and the Sonnet in Early Modern Europe. He has published essays in the Review of English Studies, Shakespeare Survey, essays in criticism, and studies in philology, and in several edited collections. His research has been funded by long-term research grants from the Leverhulme Trust and the Wolfson Foundation, and by short-term research grants as well from the New York Public Library Harry Ransom Center and the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. The paper is titled Queer Prosody, Rhyme's Voice in the Taming of the Shrew. Thank you, Robert, for coming today. We're all ears.
Thank you, Iman. Thank you very much for keeping us in order and for your kind introductions. Thank you to Hannah and Lizzie and Hannah, for putting together this terrific schedule of events. I'm hoping to attend every single one, but I gather there's been such demand that they book up pretty quickly. I'm going to be speaking about poetry today in the artisanal sense of that word. That is, I'm going to be opposing poetry to prose rather than poetry to novels or poetry to drama, say. So I'm not going to particularly be thinking about sonnets or narrative poems. And I'm going to be trying out something for me because, as Iman said, I'm somewhere in between books, I suppose, at the moment. I've written this book about blank verse, and now I'm starting to think about the sexuality of sonnet form. So I'm going to try something a bit in between in a rather ginger, nervous sort of way and talk about the gendering and the sexualizing of prosody. And I also thought this would chime rather well with Colby's paper, which for me was revelatory and fascinating. This is a much shrunken, etiolated, really, version of an essay that's forthcoming in Studies in Philology. Now, I shall try to share my screen. Please bear with me while I fumble around hopelessly. Okay. Can everyone see that PowerPoint? Yes, great, excellent. Right. Sorry, here we go. All right, we're off. Rhyme can be a queer thing. It exists in the hind parts of words and verse lines. It is, in that sense, arsi-versi, acoustically foregrounding what is at the back. As Gillian Beer has put it, we read forwards, but rhyme backwards. Rhyme can be prosody's fundament, and as such, might be open to the sodomitical. Now, even those apparently bold or tendentious claims assume, straight-lacedly, that we know where rhyme is. But when two words are rhymed, where is the rhyme? Is it on the second rhymed word, as we tend to experience it, or on the first, which perhaps we should think of as the rhyme's point of conception? Or is it somewhere amid the two, between the anteriority of the first word, what the French call rime d'attente, and the posteriority of the second word, what the French call rime écho? Rhyme has the elusiveness that in the now quite long tradition of queer theory also often characterizes the queer. What is more, both the word and the practice of rhyme have undergone versions of gender trouble. The OED's etymology for the English noun rhyme ends with the puzzled note, underlined in bold here, that the French word, that is rime, is feminine, whereas both etymologies given above suggest that it should be masculine. This discrepancy still lacks a satisfactory explanation. Compare, as the OED's etymologists proceed to do, the Old Occitan and Catalan word rim, masculine in the 13th and 14th centuries, respectively, with the equivalent rima, feminine, a century earlier in both cases. So the terminology of rhyme offers us an apparently stable gender binary in which some rhymes can be masculine, that is, where the rhyme occurs on a stress syllable, and some rhymes can be feminine, that is, where the rhyme occurs on an unstressed syllable. Yet this neat terminological separation is not how things materialized in the 16th century, when the first English translations of the French terms rime masculine and rime féminine appeared. In many of the early discussions of gendered rhyme in English, masculine and feminine rhyme have to be held apart lest one corrupt, dilute, or even seduce the other. Feminine rhyme, in particular, seems to pose its writers, readers, and hearers a whole load of gender trouble. It is, in that sense, acutely genderqueer. Issuing a brief apology to his 1591 translation of the Orlando Furioso, Sir John Harrington initially set his store in feminine rhyme. After all, he writes, Sir Philip Sidney not only useth them, but affecteth them, and, he adds, they be so approved in other languages that the French have even given them a name. Yet Harrington soon hears these feminine rhymes under the aegis of their gender as more troubling to his prosodic design and qualifies his initial enthusiasm. I would have the ear fed, but not cloyed, with these pleasing and sweet-fooling meters. Feminine rhyme comes to sound at once excessive and trivial and a bit seductive too. Perhaps Harrington ventures it would be best to part his word, to part the feminine rhymes of his translation with masculine rhyme, as happened in much 16th century French lyric. Quote, a one-syllable meter, by which he means here a masculine rhyme, between the feminine rhymes, would give it, his verse, best grace, steadying what would otherwise be a feminine glut. Harrington's ultimately cautious, even apotropaic discussion of feminine rhyme suspends his poem somewhere between a male and a female style, just as on Thomas Coxon's frontispiece for the translation, the promise of a masculine heroical verse is typographically situated between an armoured Mars and a scantily dressed Venus, with Cupid provocatively tugging at the clothes about her waist. In his defence of poesy, Sir Philip Sidney breaks off as he describes what he calls the female rhyme, dismissively protesting that I find already the triflingness of this discourse is much too much enlarged. This enlarged discourse might not be as trifling as Sidney makes it sound, because one major early modern account of sex difference, famously written about by Stephen Greenblatt, contended that the clitoris could enlarge into a penis at especially high temperatures, extending outward as it is otherwise extending inward. Like the feminine ending, the feminine rhyme can be a means of such extension. Some definitions of the feminine rhyme insist upon its adding an extra syllable to the verse line, moving a pentameter, say, one syllable beyond its usual 10, and in doing so nudging one verse line to extend, sometimes furtively, into the next. In another early modern apology for poetry, this time a defense of rhyme from 1603, Samuel Daniel concludes with the chauvinistic ear that feminine rhyme is fittest for ditties. he relates a conversation with Hugh Sanford, in which Sanford warned him, Daniel, of that deformity when writers mix uncertainly feminine rhyme with masculine. Daniel revised his own verse in this spirit of metrical insecurity, deleting 12 feminine rhymes from the 1592 edition of his sonnet sequence Delia, and another 25 from the 1594 edition. For Sanford, and eventually for Daniel, feminine rhymes should not be allowed that uncertain congress with their masculine counterparts. Otherwise, rhyming could be a little too much like heterosexual sex. If one reproof of poetry is lightness and wantonness, as Harrington contended earlier in the Apology, and if, this is Harrington again, as Sir Philip Sidney confesseth, Cupido is crept even into the heroical poems, like Harrington's Furioso, then the mingling of feminine and masculine rhyme threatens not only that textual sexual intercourse between the two rhyme genders, but a hermaphroditic rhetoric or poetics in which gender could be confounded. Cupido, remember, is among other things a sibling of Hermaphroditus. I wonder whether Daniel's anxieties about feminine rhyme caught Shakespeare's ear in the 1590s. We know that Shakespeare read, often ransacked Daniel. He drew on almost all of Daniel's work, though substantially from Delia and his History of the Wars of the Roses. Daniel's Complaint of Rosamond, first printed with the 1592 Delia, is probably the most important predecessor of Shakespeare's A Lover's Complaint, both of which were printed with their respective sonnet collections. And Shakespeare's sonnets are clearly in something of a Delian tradition, as Brian Vickers has put it. Given all this, it seems, I think, reasonably likely that Shakespeare knew something of Daniel's anxieties about the feminine rhyme, and then, I'd argue, made those anxieties central to some of his own verse. Think of the poem that we've been hearing about in Colby's paper, Sonnet 20, Shakespeare's Sonnet 20, which is not only about the, and here I hesitate over the adjective I want to use, the hermaphroditic, the trans quality of the poem's master mistress, but it's also about the trans or hermaphroditic quality of the poem in which every rhyme is feminine. Shakespeare probably filched that prosodic conceit from Sonnet 17 of Daniel's Delia, in which every rhyme is feminine too. So Shakespeare's Sonnet 20 could be read as, among other things, an early response to Daniel's fretting over feminine rhyme. We know that some of Shakespeare's sonnets were circulating in manuscript by the late 1590s, when Francis Mears mentions them in 1598, and various scholars have argued, on the basis of rare word testing, among other things, that Sonnet 20 was one of a cluster written in the first few years of the 90s. Among Shakespeare's experiments with rhyme in the 1590s, from the audacious polysyllabic rhymes of Love's Labour's Lost, I'm thinking of that great rhyme between Commander and Alexander, to the grim rhyme repetitions on and of the word hand in Titus Andronicus, we get the gendered rhymes of The Taming of the Shrew. Shrew is a play with quite a lot of rhyme, even by the standards of Shakespeare's very rhyming decade, and it has a particularly high quantity of feminine rhyme too. I don't have time now to run through all the rhymes of The Taming of the Shrew, so this paper will have to serve as a trailer for my much longer essay in Studies in Philology. But let's listen to a few kinds of rhyming, or a few rhyming moments in The Taming of the Shrew, and what happens with the gendering of rhyme in that play, and the queering work it often accomplishes. When the status of male characters in the play becomes precipitous or doubtful, their rhymes typically turn feminine. So when the servant Tranio changes places and names with his master Licentio, both start to risk speaking feminine rhyme. It does rather depend on the syllabics of their names. Is it Tranio, masculine, or Tranio, feminine? Licentio rhymes internally on his name and Tranio's, as you can see at the top of this slide, before Tranio constructs a potentially feminine end rhyme out of both of their names, at the second instance on this slide. The mix-up in their names and in their positions within that master-servant relationship appears to threaten the corresponding instability in their genders. And this seems pretty suitable, right, for a play that makes much of gendered female service and servitude. Some of this business here has to do with the putatively feminine shape of the Italian language from which their names derive. The Italian hendecasyllable, which had become through versi sciolti a sort of Italian a precursor to blank verse, if that's not too English blank verse, if that's not too teleological a way to put it, ends on an unstressed 11th syllable, teeing the language up for an abundance of feminine rhyme and feminine ending. It's therefore important that Catherine's name should occasionally be Italianized as Katharina, whether in speech, stage directions, speech prefixes, or editorial and critical tradition. By ending with an unstressed syllable, Katharina, her name is always potentially a feminine rhyme. Every time a male character speaks the name, he risks being troubled by a feminine sort of prosody. And this can happen even without her name, Italianate or English, being articulated. When Gremio indulges in blokish banter about how Petruchio might win her, Catherine, that is, Grumio undoes his masculine confidence with a feminine rhyme. He would, I were assured, of a good dinner. The comic doubt that Grumio's feminine rhyme throws upon Petruchio's masculine powers of seduction might then be picked up later in the play in Act 3, Scene 3, when Petruchio appears to capitulate to Catherine by speaking in feminine rhyme, "O Kate, content thee, prithee be not angry." Later in that scene, Gremio thinks Petruchio has been cated, overcome by Catherine, and in saying so fashions a feminine rhyme with or out of Bianca's line that being mad herself, she's madly mated. These feminine rhymes appear to challenge, or at least to unsteady, and perhaps even to queer, the play's masculinities. Many of the play's scenes end on a feminine couplet. I give you a few instances here. Act 1, Scene 2 ends with Hortensio's rhyme, again drawing on the prosodic femininity of Italian. Act 2, Scene 1 ends on that feminine rhyme between wooing and cunning. 3-1 on a feminine rhyme between ranging and changing. Here are some more. 4-2 and 4-5 end on feminine rhymes that are also repetitions, rhymes on the same word. In fact, almost all of the play's scenes that end with a rhyme do so with a feminine rhyme. The feminine rhyme becomes a sort of soundtrack to the world of the play, where a female voice, or something akin to a female voice, is not only heard, but manages to get the last word, at least for that scene. Gradually, though, the play's feminine rhymes are worn down. The play's male characters increasingly put masculine rhyme adjacent to Catherine's name. Catherine the Cursed, a title for a maid of all titles, the worst. And they gradually harrow her name, as Laurie Maguire has written brilliantly about, to a diminutive masculine rhymed Kate. Think of Petruchio's rhyme between gate and Kate. "Come, my sweet Kate," says Petruchio immediately before the final scene. "Better once than never, for never too late." Masculine rhyme again. The woman who'd once protested, "They call me Catherine that do talk of me," now exits with him in silence. Before the final scene, though, there is always the possibility of feminine rhyme gaining or regaining the upper hand, partly, I think, because of the continuing prevalence of those feminine couplets at the ends of scenes. Catherine's closing speech therefore poses quite a metrical shock. All her rhymes are now masculine: sway, obey, hearts, parts, and conclude in that abjectly masculine double couplet. "Then veil your stomachs, for it is no boot, and place your hands below your husband's foot, in token of which duty, if he please, my hand is ready, may it do him ease." There have been many efforts to eke a latent protest from Catherine's oration, of course, from Mary Pickford's 1929 Catherine winking at the other women during her speech, to Sian Phillips and Vanessa Redgrave speaking the speech with tongue-in-cheek or irony unchecked. Yet Catherine's succession of masculine couplets in that final speech of hers work in the opposite way to the play's many feminine rhymes. Where feminine rhyme indicates in that Italian hendecasyllabic style the possibility for the line to run on, to continue to the next line in search of a stress, the masculine rhyme of these couplets insists upon the verse line's limit. In metrical terms, Catherine has bridled her own tongue, and has done so, paradoxically, in an apparently garrulous speech. It's the longest in the play. So the gendered rhymes of The Taming of the Shrew, particularly towards its ending, can ultimately seem pretty straight, even if they sometimes hold out the possibility of queering the play's masculinities. Even when doing that, the latter, they can produce an old heterosexist binary between the wordy, plaintive, seductive female and the terse, disciplined male. To understand the queerness of, or the residual queerness of the play's prosody, as I hear it, other than the ways in which the feminine rhymes of the play come to vex the masculine, we need to think about who's speaking many of these rhymes, the boy actors who voice them, to think about how the affordances of the boy actors' voices chime with the play's gendered rhymes, to such an extent, I think, that the voice of the boy actor playing Catherine becomes a meta-theatrical feature of the drama. We can particularly hear the boy actor's male effeminacy, in Lisa Jardine's phrase, through one much recorded limitation, though really we'll see aptitude, of the boy actor's voice. If on the cusp of puberty, the boys would have spoken the rhymes with squeaking, unstable, cracked voices. All of those adjectives there come from Gina Bloom's book. Thus, Malvolio describes Cesario Viola as not yet old enough for a man, nor young enough for a boy, noting that he therefore speaks very shrewishly. And I'll try not to underline too much that final adverb, convenient for my argument though it is. Shakespeare dwells on the squeak and crack of the adolescent voice, from the actor buoying Cleopatra's greatness to the mannish crack afflicting Arviragus and Guiderius in Cymbeline. Portia proposes not only to be accoutred like a boy, but to speak between the change of man and boy with a reed voice. And Hamlet, of course, hopes that a boy actor's voice, like a piece of uncurrent gold, be not cracked within the ring. As Gina Bloom has noted, a vocal crack is a partial fracture, it's not a full breakage. In the case of early modern boy actors, we might regard the vocal crack as suitably precarious, sometimes low and, inverted commas, mannish, sometimes high and, inverted commas, feminine, sometimes both at once, and therefore as germane to the shiftingly and shiftily gendered rhymes of The Taming of the Shrew, so that those rhymes, especially when combined with those voices, do as much to perplex our sense of gender as to instantiate it, often instantiating it only in order to perplex. The cracked-voiced rhymes testify to the precarious nature of male identity and could achieve a travesty of the feminine and female too, perhaps by evoking the supposed pitch of female orgasm, rendered in plays of this period as a ludicrous squeak or squeal. That is, the rhymes would have been spoken by voices either replete with early modern gender markers, both male and female, or curiously without them, neither quite male nor quite female, with voices that might be thought queer or queering. Together with the gendered rhymes of Shakespeare's Shrew, they could diminish our sense of gender's grasp on us altogether, exposing it as an effect, an imposition, a stylization, realizing with Judith Butler that all genders like drag or is drag, and that imitation is at the heart of any gendered binarism. One way to think about Catherine's speech toward the end of Shrew is as a sort of metrical allegory for the early modern marriage ceremony, that union of male and female in which the maiden name gets displaced by the male, just as in her oration, the feminine rhyme gets ultimately displaced by the masculine rhyme. However, the solemnization of matrimony in the Book of Common Prayer does not envisage marriage or the marriage ceremony as an absorption of the female identity by the male. If anything, it's the reverse. Here we are. For this cause shall a man leave father and mother and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. The BCP's conceit of an almost hermaphroditic marriage, or perhaps a marriage as something quintessentially trans, was not unusual in Shakespeare's culture. Thomas Gainsford saw in matrimony two bodies, one flesh, two hearts, one soul, so that husband and wife, truly loving, so conspire in all their actions that they have in a manner but one motion. Thomas Overbury's sketch of a wife noted how one thus made two, marriage doth reunite, and made them both, but one hermaphrodite. This hermaphroditic joining into one flesh is something the play's prosody has long been entertaining before Catherine's oration, through its unsteadying of the distinctions between masculine and feminine rhyme, with each butting up against or blurring into the other. Yet when we consider the voicing of the play's prosody around its ending, it becomes more difficult to conceive of it as representing a happy marriage or a perfect confluence of genders. We're hearing a boy actor, playing Catherine, make some sort of contract with an adult male actor, playing Petruchio, so that the play seems as much about a boy's indenturing or impressment into a theatre company. Remember that the commercial playing companies often relied upon and imitated the formal economy of apprenticeship, as it is about a marriage. Thus, in The Taming of the Shrew, earlier on, we hear the boy actor playing Catherine, forced to learn a script, Petruchio's of calling the sun the moon, and directed to perform stage action, laying their hand under another actor's foot. In The Taming of the Shrew, that pattern of theatrical apprenticeship is also vocal. The boy actor playing Catherine begins with disorderly utterance, an amateur shrewishness originating in him being, in Malvolio's words, not yet old enough for a man nor young enough for a boy, with the gendered or genderless cracks and squeaks this entails, which means, as we heard Malvolio observe, he speaks very shrewishly. He moves on to a carefully controlled, Petruchio-prompted script about the sun being the moon, and ends with the long, final solo oration that can demonstrate his eventual actorly mastery. Now, if this sounds a kind of upbeat narrative, I don't really think it is. After all, unlike the formal destination of most early modern apprenticeships, there's not a whole lot of evidence of boy actors being granted freedom or freedoms at the end of their service. Records are anyway thin on the ground, but there are about 35 confirmed cases of those freedoms having been bestowed. And Gerald Eads Bentley has calculated that only 3% of adult players in London from 1590 to 1642 have begun their careers as boy apprentices and then made that transition to hired man or company sharer. If listening to Catherine's speech is a bleak experience, then listening to the boy actor's speech might be even bleaker still. Now I'm going to cheer you up as I come to the final stretch of this paper, because we must remember that Catherine's oration isn't the end of the play. What comes next casts prosodic doubt on the metrical masculinity of her speech. Petruchio's instruction or invitation to kiss me, Kate, is bungled into an awkward rhyme with Licentio's, well, go thy ways, old lad, for thou shalt hate. The old habits of making masculine rhyme out of Catherine's abbreviated name no longer quite work as well as they had. And were it not for Licentio's contraction or elision in hate, the rhyme would teeter towards the feminine because habit would end on an unstressed syllable. Then Licentio and Vincentio rhyme a couplet with a feminine unstress at the end of the second line, tuud, fruud, so that we hear the undervoice of feminine rhyme come up to the surface once again. Petruchio proceeds to re-establish masculine rhyme. We can see it here, bed, sped, white knight, and with that, exeunt the freshly married couple. At least that's the way most texts give us the stage direction. The folio text exits only for Petruchio, which is a fascinating indication that Catherine might remain on stage unless she's now totally subsumed into her husband's identity. The last rhyme of the play is Hortensio and Licentio's rather feeble couplet, as Anne Thompson puts it in her edition of the play. Now go thy ways, thou hast tamed a cursed shrew. 'Tis a wonder by your leave she will be tamed so. Now the word shrew can be pronounced shrow in order to secure the rhyme, and the folio text is spelled that way, S-H-R-O-W. But the word is spelled shrew, S-H-R-E-W, earlier in the folio scene, and in the folio's version of Act 4, Scene 1, suggesting an attempt at this point by compositor D, usually held to be responsible for the entire scene, to straighten out the rhyme, in an instance of what Geoffrey Masten spells orthography, right, writing, since orthos is straight, upright, standing, the opposite of crooked, and what Carlo Freccero calls philology, where the constitution of language is made to be masculine and straight. So does that thwart or maybe bent final rhyme imply a lack of conviction, either on the characters or on Shakespeare's or in some sense on the play's part? For wonder, Licentio's word, can mean a number of things too. Could it mean that we should consider whether, instead of marvelling at how, Catherine has been transformed into a tamed animal? Or if she has, whether it's a spectacle, a wonder to be celebrated? Even if Catherine's speech wasn't given a sarcastic, ironical, or unconvinced voicing on the 16th century stage, it would have to be troubled, queered even, by the gender of the boy actor's vocal delivery. His speech even features that meta-theatrical joke about how women's soft conditions and our hearts should well agree with our external parts, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, and so on. The speech must have seemed somewhere between male and female, or masculine and feminine, exposing the blurry artificiality and contingency of each, and dwelling as much on putatively male anxieties as on putatively female acquiescence. Some of those anxieties would especially cluster around the boy actor, whose voice, like those of the women in the play, was constantly under threat, experiencing that vocal apprenticeship I discussed earlier. If this was the boy actor's grand solo oration, the culmination of the play's meta-theatrical apprenticeship, then it was fraught with vocal risk of the boy actor getting it wrong or lapsing into that crack and squeak. The play's masculine and feminine rhymes are, I think, part of that risk, functioning as a sort of metrical metonym for the boy actor's unstable vocal delivery, a delivery in training. It's striking then, and here I'll end, that the word voice only features once in the play, during its induction. There, the Lord assures us and the onstage listeners that his serving boy will well usurp the grace, voice, gait, and action of a gentlewoman. The play bears out his words, not as a reassurance, though, as the Lord might have it, but as a troubled prologue to what we will hear in Catherine, in all the boys' roles, play out before our ears. If we end the play feeling confused or bothered, and I think most of us feel bothered at the very least, it's partly because we do not quite know how to voice it, or how to locate its voice, or what its voicings, plural perhaps, especially those rhymed voicings, might portend. It's even possible, perhaps the most troubling thought of all, that what sounds to modern ears, or what can sound to modern ears, like the play's destabilization of gender norms, might to earlier ears have sounded like an attempted reification of a gender system which, like today's, often depended on disparagement. So the queer prosody of the play can even, or especially, queer itself, for as the great queer theorist Lee Edelman has put it, queerness can never define an identity, it can only ever disturb one. Thank you for listening with me.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was another great paper. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I just really liked how the two papers spoke to each other in really interesting ways.